The Supreme Court is currently hearing arguments about birthright citizenship, but also the ability for lower courts to issue universal injunctions. And I got to say, this one's getting pretty spicy and interesting, but it's not looking particularly good for the Trump administration as it pertains to birthright citizenship. Still, we don't know exactly what will happen, but the principal arguments, probably one of the more dominant arguments from the pro-birthright citizenship side, is that this question was already answered some 120 years ago, and we have over 100 years of executive action and legislation built upon the understanding that if you are born in this country, by any means, you are a citizen. Now, Donald Trump has called this stupid, saying no one intended for people on vacation to be able to just be American citizens or to have a child who is. And I think that there is a strong argument in what was the purpose of birthright citizenship and how does technology apply to it? Now, one of the arguments we often hear is that the founding fathers understood technology developed. But I also think it's fair to say that they didn't understand the degree to which it was going to develop, just that it would. And now what do we find? Near universally, as it applies to the Second Amendment, even Republican 2A guys, even 2A YouTubers have argued to me people should not be allowed to have nuclear weapons or biological weapons. Thus, there is something within people where they consider technological development does presuppose the Constitution has limits based on what technology would be developed. It's an interesting argument, and I don't think it's a simple principle matter. Some might say, no, we can't go that route because they'll take away our guns or our free speech or whatever. No, I think it's an issue of asking the moral limitations that we decide as a people, as it's always been. Michael Malice tells me this is anarchist thinking. The idea that only those with the power to enforce will enforce. Sure, he's right. We as a moral country try to figure out what makes the most sense as it pertains to law and what is the intent of the law. Not, it's plain text reading means we can't stop birth tourism and people trying to destroy our country. Well, then our country ceases to exist. These questions need to be answered. And unfortunately, I believe that our Supreme Court will largely be spineless. And I believe that on the matter of universal injunctions, they'll also be spineless. But I don't know for sure. Of course, we're going to hear from Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito, and they're usually based. They're going to come out and they're going to say what is logically true and correct that most of us agree with. So right now, the arguments are currently wrapping up. I can give you the basic breakdown of what is currently happening in that regard. Before we do, of course, shout out to Steven Crowder and the Mug Club. You guys rock. Thank you for joining us in this Rumble morning lineup. Of course, I'm your host for the noon hour, Tim Pool. You can follow me on X and Instagram at Timcast. And I want to just shout all of you guys out with your viewership, you guys tuning in every morning. This morning show is the, on average, 7th biggest live stream in the country. Not always hitting that number, sometimes a little better, sometimes a little worse. As it pertains to news in general, I think we're number 4. But for all streams, thanks to you guys, it's been a tremendous show. So I really do appreciate it. Now, before we get started, we got a great sponsor this morning. It is Tax Network USA. Go to tnusa.com/Tim. My friends, tax day may have passed, but for millions of Americans, the real trouble is just beginning. If you missed the April 15th deadline or still owe back taxes, the IRS is ramping up enforcement. Every day you wait only makes things worse. With over 5,000 new tax liens filed daily and tools like property seizures, bank levies, and wage garnishments, the IRS is applying pressure at levels we haven't seen in years. Increased administrative scrutiny means collections are moving fast. The good news, there's still time for Tax Network USA to help. Self-employed or business owner, even if your books are a mess, they've got it covered. Tax Network USA specializes in cleaning up financial chaos and getting you back on track fast. Even after the deadline, it's not too late to regain control. Your consultation is completely free, and acting now could stop penalties, threatening letters, and surprise levies before they escalate. Call 1-800-958-1000 or visit tnusa.com/Tim. You may have missed April 15th, but you haven't run out of options. Let Tax Network USA help before the IRS makes the next move. So shout out for them. Shout out to Tax Network for sponsoring the show. Also, just want to add, we are going to be joined later on by Rep. Thomas Massie as we discuss a little bit of these issues, but largely the spending bill. Right now, the question about what Donald Trump is trying to get done hinges on whether or not Congress will pass this spending bill. Now, of course, Thomas Massie has largely been against this spending, but I do have questions. The Supreme Court, activists, lawsuits, injunctions, they're going to jam Trump up every which way. Unfortunately for Trump, even with the Republicans in control of the House, not everybody is in agreement on how these things should go. So, Thomas Massie, we'll be talking to him. And we're big fans, by the way, despite our political agreement sometimes. He's a really good dude. Let's get started here with this news from Donald Trump. Trump calls U.S. stupid over birthright citizenship. Updates. President Donald Trump said Thursday morning the country is stupid for allowing birthright citizenship in the United States, adding that it leads to dysfunction of America. The president urged the Supreme Court to test the limits of the 14th Amendment, which reads, quote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. His remarks came ahead of the Supreme Court's decision to hear oral arguments on several other emergency requests from the Trump administration. Within this argument is another question. Can lower courts issue universal injunctions? Guys, okay, maybe this is where Tim Pool is now more right-wing on the issue, I guess, because I tend to be pretty liberal on a lot of things. The purpose of the 14th Amendment for literally anybody who studies history was to say, if you are a slave, okay, but you were born here, enough. You're a citizen. Moving on. The purpose of the 14th Amendment was not to allow a Chinese couple to fly to the U.S. on a temporary tourist visa, give birth, and then have their child be an American citizen, fly that child back to China where they grow up for 20 years. That Chinese national moves to the United States. 15 years later, they're running for president or they're in Congress. If that's what the founding fathers actually thought, well, then they were setting us up for failure. But I don't think, well, to be fair, the founding fathers largely didn't answer this question. This came after the Civil War. The 13th and 14th Amendments were largely made to address the issue of slavery. Now, there was actually a really great quote. Let me see if I can find it, actually. This one matters. The senator who wrote the 14th Amendment, senator who wrote 14th Amendment statement on foreign nationals. Let me see if I can find that quote for you as we carry on with this news and information. They say, what is it? House bill would track advanced chips. There's nothing related to. So this is the rest of that is unrelated to Trump and the birthright citizenship. So I do have the quote for you. Let me read this. The senator who authored the 14th Amendment was Senator Jacob Howard of Michigan. When introducing the citizenship clause in 1866, he clarified its meaning regarding foreign nationals. Quote, this will not, of course, include persons born in the United States who are foreigners, aliens who belong to the families of ambassadors or foreign ministers. Now, let me ask, I want to get this full quote here. We'll get the full quote. But in the meantime, let me pull up this from the Constitution. And it says, let me see if I actually have the full source here. Constitutional Accountability Center. I want to make sure I have the full quote because you're right. Okay. All right. I think I have the full. Let's pull this in. This is the constitution.org, Truths and Untruths about the Constitution, Origins of Birthright Citizenship. This is from 2011, mind you. It reads, as our Americans and our elected leaders engage in debate over immigration and the constitutional guarantee of citizenship at birth, there is something we should be able to agree on. Misleading statements about constitutional history do not help us understand the Constitution better or to allow us to tackle immigration reform in good faith. It was thus disheartening to see Rep. Lamar Smith, new chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, again, 2011, mind you, seriously mislead the public in a letter to the editor printed in the LA Times. So I'm not sure if their position on this one is going to be pro or against, but I just wanted to make sure the full quote. Quote, every person born within the limits of the United States and subject to their jurisdiction is by virtue of natural law and national law a citizen of the United States. This will not, of course, include persons born in the United States who are foreigners, aliens who belong to families of ambassadors or foreign ministers accredited to the government of the United States, but will include every other class of persons. They're going to say the reason why it's important is because anti-citizenship advocates seize upon the phrase subject to the jurisdiction thereof in the 14th Amendment, guarantee that all persons born or naturalized in the United States. Okay, you get it. The incomplete portion of the quote used by Rep. Smith in his LA Times letter appears to support the view the citizenship clause was drafted to exclude children of foreigners who are not subject to the U.S. jurisdiction. But the full sentence shows otherwise. This is their argument. The argument presented by the left on the issue is that it's not saying foreigners, aliens, and those who belong to families of ambassadors. It's saying foreigners who belong. The aliens is just a qualifier. Now, I don't rightly care what your interpretation of that sentence is. What matters to me is every person born within the limits of the United States and subject to their jurisdiction is by virtue of natural law a citizen of the U.S. This is where the mistake is being brought up and the interpretation is incorrect. I want to show you in the actual 14th Amendment. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Okay. Now let's take a look at the 13th Amendment. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist in the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. These two amendments were specifically about resolving the issue of slavery after the Civil War. This sentence, which opens the amendment, is clear. The problem is we are dealing with the children of children of children of children of children after these things had happened. Now, if you want to make the argument that they did intend literally after this point, literally anybody born here was a citizen, by all means. My argument following this is that is untenable for a nation and it will lead to its demise. Thus, considering the advent of transportation technologies, airplanes, we may need to reassess how we prioritize citizenship. But I don't think we even need to go there. I think anybody who's read about basic Civil War history can understand the goal here. You had a bunch of people who were slaves. You had questions as to whether or not these people were allowed to vote. This is pre-Civil War. The 3/5 compromise. Now, incorrectly, many people on the left believe that the North was trying to say slaves should be allowed to vote. And the South was like, but they're not people. Wrong. The South, the Confederates, well, pre-Confederacy, but the Southerners, the slave states, were arguing that slaves counted as people who could vote. The North said, no way. You can't own a person and then have them vote. They'll just vote for how you tell them to vote. So they came up with a compromise. Okay, each slave will count as 3/5 of a vote. The South wanted them to be able to vote. Not that they were granting them any decency or dignity or human rights. So that's not to say that they were good people. The point is, after the war ended, when they put these amendments in place ending slavery, what was the question as to if you were a slave? Look, if you were born here, or naturalized, of course, and you're subject to our jurisdiction, you're a citizen. Let's break it down. If you were not born here, and you were not subject to our jurisdiction, they were not granting you citizenship. This excluded Native Americans. That was part of it. They were not saying from this point forward, literally anybody born here will be a citizen. They were saying the people who are already born here. It was descriptive, not prescriptive. Yet here we are. Let me show you an example of why this is stupid. Birth tourism organizer jailed over scheme to bring pregnant Chinese women to U.S. Is this what you think the leaders of this nation wanted to happen? Now, I'll make another argument. By all means, there's an interpretation, as I showed you this quote, where he says, this is Jacob Howard. This will not, of course, include persons born in the U.S. who are foreigners, comma, aliens, comma, who belong to the families of ambassadors or foreign ministers accredited to the government or foreign ministers accredited the government of the United States. There's an or. There's an or. Okay, throw that one out the window. By all means, because I'm going to keep the argument going. I believe they were saying foreigners are not going to be citizens because that's completely illogical. Do you think if you went back after the Civil War and said, we believe, if you went to these senators, if you went to the politicians, members of Congress and the president, after the Civil War and said, let's just be clear, we want families from China and from Tripoli to be able to come to the United States, give birth, leave, come back later, and their child will be a citizen who can run for president. They'd be like, what? No, absolutely not. Even after the Civil War with all these amendments, they were still extremely racist. People think the North weren't racist. It's like, yo, it's weird how people view history, to be completely honest. Y'all do realize these people were like, the Northerners were trying to end slavery because they opposed the racist policies. No, they didn't. They maintained Jim Crow. They maintained segregation. The South was racist, but the North was very racist too. Birth tourism. Look at this story. A California woman was sentenced Monday to more than 3 years in prison in a long-running case over a business that helped pregnant Chinese women travel to the U.S. to deliver babies who automatically became U.S. citizens. U.S. District Judge Gary Klausner gave Phoebe Dong a 41-month sentence and ordered her immediately taken into custody from his federal court in L.A. Dong and her husband were convicted in September of conspiracy and money laundering through their company, USA Happy Baby. Yikes. The sentencing came as birthright citizenship has been thrust into the spotlight in the U.S. with the return of President Donald Trump to the White House. Of course, this was in January. Does anyone really believe that this is what the leaders of this country wanted to happen? So let's pause. Let's say they are correct on the merits in every capacity. Then we need a change in the system right now. And if it was expected to be that anybody born here for any reason was a citizen, time to change it. You know what I really can't say? I do a lot of debates with these liberals. We have the culture war, of course. Whenever you make the point where it says, we have argued this, we have asserted our positions, now for the sake of argument, let's advance to the next point. They go, aha, I won. No, I'm saying you're wrong. No sane person thinks that a random person from another country can just come here, give birth, and then leave, and that kid's a citizen. That's what Trump is saying is stupid. People on vacation give birth and their kid's a citizen now? It's birth tourism, and that is exploiting our goodwill. A country cannot sustain this. You're going to have a president who was born in Iran, who's Iranian. Like, our adversaries can exploit this and then have someone run for president. That's ridiculous. Imagine after the war, you went to them and said, the British Crown is sending a pregnant woman here to give birth here in New York so that in 35 years, they can just have him run for office and then regain control of the colonies. They'd be like, to hell with that. No way. They might actually be like, we don't know or care as long as they're here and a citizen and these are the rules. No, I think they might say, you can't have a kid born here just so you can do that. Right. I'll make the argument this way. I think people should not have nuclear weapons. I think people should not have biological weapons. However, the Second Amendment says the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It does not define arms because arms were understood. The argument for the left on gun control is arms back then were muzzle-loading muskets. And that's what they expected people to have. Counterpoint. People also had privateers, man-o'-wars, and grape shot. If you don't know, that's like when they spray a bunch of little balls. They also had, what's the one? They had was chain rounds. I don't know what they're called. They would fire cannonballs chained to each other so they'd swing around like crazy stuff to maximize damage to vessels. Private individuals had cannons. They knew this. Now, we recognize it's a problem if people start building nuclear weapons or radioactive devices. So we said no. And nobody fought against it. Some people did, don't get me wrong. But largely, even the 2A people are like, nah, I'm not about that. Okay. Then you've recognized that there is a limitation based on technology for what you perceive to be a God-given right. I don't. I think that the Constitution needs to be amended. That being said, I'm willing to entertain the argument that in order to maintain civilization post-technological advancement, which will keep happening, we may need to reassess not the previous standard, but the standard moving forward. That is to say, the founding fathers, let's just say for the sake of argument, say, no, if someone's here and they give birth, they're a citizen. Well, the problem with that is, what about their parents? That never made sense. Let's say a Mexican family traveled 1,000 miles to what is it going to be, like 2,000, 3,000 miles from Mexico to New York. Arrived in New York, gave birth. And then they were like, this child is a citizen. You're not. Get out. That doesn't make sense. Why would they grant citizenship to the baby when the parents don't have any rights to be here and they just send them out anyway? So that never made sense. But let's just, for the sake of argument, say they were like, sure, okay, fine. One thing that no one predicted, you'd be able to fly for real. Even at the point when they were about to discover flight, people were claiming, scientists, that heavier than air flight was impossible. The idea that you could travel from London to New York in a couple of hours, but 5, 6, 7 hours. Back then, planes were a lot slower, so I think it was like probably 10 or 12. But think about that. They used to get on boats, and those boats took months. And then I think after the Industrial Revolution, we had steamships. We were able to make those trips in a matter of weeks. But then they were like, let's build a plane. And all of a sudden, somebody flew, and they were like, whoa. Now the problem is, you've got somebody, imagine this. Imagine somebody, this is how stupid the whole thing is. Imagine somebody gets in a plane, let's call it a single-engine Cessna. I don't know if it can make the trip, but let's say they modify a small plane just with 2 people on it, a pregnant lady literally on the verge, or let's just say she's literally going into labor. The plane flies, enters U.S. airspace, and they say, hey, you get that plane out of here. You can't land that plane here. You're in violation of U.S. airspace. And they say, we're just 2 people. We're doing an emergency landing. And so the military gets involved, Air Force gets involved. They force a landing down, approaching the vessel at gunpoint, and then opens the door. They look inside, and literally a minute after the plane touchdown, the woman gives birth. The baby comes out, and they go, drat! They entered this country illegally by plane, but she gave birth right in the moment, so that child is an American citizen. Seriously? Like, that makes sense? It does not make sense. There is a civic, logical purpose to why we do these things. Now, I don't want to harp on too much because we do have a lot to talk about. I also want to make sure we get into the issue of universal injunctions, which did come up in this debate. In the arguments to SCOTUS, the question of universal injunctions came up, and I got to say, I am flabbergasted by the political activism of the courts, Ketanji Brown Jackson, and just the liberal justice in general. The U.S. government was arguing, you cannot enjoin the government from taking a universal action national. You can't issue an injunction because one person filed a suit. The response from, I think it was Ketanji Brown Jackson, she was saying, so if you have someone claiming the government is doing a thing that's unlawful, and they get an injunction, how do you stop that unlawful activity from happening? I'm just sitting here like, oh my God. She adds, she says, I think it could have been somebody else, but one of the liberal judges says, you're saying that every single person will have to hire a lawyer and file a lawsuit in order to get relief. And it's like, yes, that's always been the case. The argument the government is making is, if you were a single individual and you file a lawsuit, relief can only be granted to you. Agreed. They then said, so you're saying, Amy Coney Barrett was even asking about this. It's not looking good for the U.S. for Trump's administration. She was saying, so what if a class is formed and, here's how it's supposed to work. Universal injunctions, I believe, are unconstitutional. The idea that a lower court judge can block the president, literally, there's 677 district judges. That means anything Trump does, he's going to get stopped. Here was a great argument from the U.S. They said, we issued an order, I think this was on the military, and we got sued. The lower court issued a universal injunction, so we appealed. The appellate court stayed the injunction, ruling in our favor to continue pending litigation. At that moment, another injunction was issued by a different judge, stopping us. So this is insanity. They're correct. Think about how stupid that is. You say, hey, we're not going to take people in the military who are suffering from this mental disorder under the DSM-5. Someone sues you. Court says, you got to let everybody in. They go, okay, we're going to appeal that. Appellate court says, no. Until we figure out how to handle this constitutionally, you can keep up this policy just on this individual. Okay, thank you, courts. They then sue in another one of the 677 jurisdictions, and they go, nope, we're going to stop Trump now. That means the executive branch is immobile and can do nothing. That was the argument being made by the left is that any one of these judges can just stop the president from engaging in his own duties, which is insane. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, my friends. We will see. So for now, the arguments have wrapped. I don't know if we'll get an immediate ruling. This is an emergency hearing, which is unusual. It was an emergency hearing. We're going to see if we get a quick answer on this one, but it's hard to know for sure. I will say this, based on listening to the arguments, it doesn't look good for the Trump administration. However, this is just one more issue. The next issue is going to be whether or not Trump can get the funding he needs for his agenda, and it ain't looking good. A 2-seat majority in Congress ain't going to be enough. Republicans are even opposing Trump. So smash the like button, share the show with everyone you know. Thank you all so much for hanging out. And we'll wrap up this portion of the show, and we will see you all 4 p.m. Rumble.com/Timcast or YouTube.com/Timcast. We've got the interview with Thomas Massey pertaining to this legislation. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you all then.